Let me just start in the beginning. You all know through your own lives with her the amazing journey that she's gone through. Born in the former Soviet Union, she was born to our great-grandmother, Babushka and Dedushka. Babushka is somebody who she relied on almost her entire life. Babushka died in 1984, and it's somebody who was the strength and backbone, and somebody Babushka Dina turned to support her every single day until the death of Babushka. Babushka was an amazing person. She believed in the life of the entire world and about how community comes before oneself. She fought on the front of World War II, in which she left her tiny little Babushka Dina and her tiny little brother and sister at home to help all the wounded soldiers and all the people dying from disease. She left them there to help the community at large. This is the person that raised Babushka. Saw something deeper in humanity, and spirituality was more important to him than worldly possessions. When Babushka Dina lived through this World War II, I know many of you know the story, but she had to go to the store one day to get whatever bread she could, and as she stood there, as she was walking to pay for this bread, the building around her was bombed and crumbled around her. She was seconds from her death. The city that she grew up in, means by the end of the war, was gone, was all bombed. And the only people that survived were the people that escaped. And she escaped with her father and brother, while her mother fought in the front. And she escaped barely, because there was no food. And when her mother came back to them, they were all on the brink of starvation. This is what she lived through. This is what built her character. Babushka Dina did not let anything or any situation ever hold her down, and she was inspired by her mother, the doctor, one that put the world and people before herself, and she herself became a doctor. And she doesn't become a doctor at any old kind. She had the gold medal in high school, which means she got an A in every single subject. Then she got the red diploma in medical school, which means she had an A in every subject. And she helped countless people in Russia as she served their needs. It's a communist country. Being a doctor wasn't for monetary reasons. Being a doctor was something that people did because they felt that calling, felt the need to help people. And at that time, being a doctor meant going from door to door to door, in the snow, in the cold, in exhaustion, without a car, to serve one person after another. And whether it be 40 people in one day during the flu season or whatever it is, that's what she did. Not only did she work tirelessly to become a doctor, she worked tirelessly to help her family. She helped her brother. She studied with him so that he could become an engineer. And she attracted the attention of Yevin, who thought that she was the most magnificent creature that has ever walked this earth. And Yevin, my grandfather, who neither I or any of my cousins or brother ever met, used to regale Dina and my mom and the stories of how much he was in love with Babushka Dina. He saw this creature of beauty, this smart, worldly, intelligent, amazing woman who had aspirations greater than anybody he knew. And he fell madly in love with her. He was an engineer himself that worked at this bicycle plant that manufactured bicycles. that area. And he would tell the story about how he and all of his fellow workers were standing around on a break, and they saw Babushka Dina walking by, and all of the men commented on this dashing beauty who walked past them, and Babushka Dina said, "That's my wife," and nobody believed him. They of course had 2 daughters, Bella and Dina first and Bella. And in a communist country, when there was nothing to be had, barely enough food, barely enough anything, you stood in line, you got what you could get. Babushka didn't think getting what you could get was enough, because she wanted her daughters to live a full and enriched life, and she would, instead of getting whatever they needed to survive, would make sure that they had the most fashionable boots. And that's something that's characteristic of Babushka in my life too. She would make sure that none of us would walk around in our sweatpants. That was not okay. We had to be the best that we could possibly be at all times. The best in our education, the best physically, the best in our surroundings, and the people we choose to enrich our lives. The rabbi has already talked about the fact that in a very short period of time, she lost her father, her husband, her brother, and she was alone with her mother, raising two daughters. I believe that Bella was 16 and Dina was 18 at the time that their father passed. But at that time, being 16 and 18 wasn't adults. You still lived with your mother. You still go to university, and your mother still helps you and feeds you and makes sure that you're taken care of. And it was around that time that Babushka Dina knew that they had to leave. There had to be another place, a better place for them. And despite her young daughter's resistance, she started to seek Israel as a new place to start anew and to have opportunities for everybody. She had this intuition, this ability to know what the next step that she must move on to before anybody else. And everything she did, she just had this, something that always led her to the right decisions. She finally was able to immigrate in 1980, but not to Israel, but to the United States. By that time, both her daughters were married, and the decision was made to go to America. And basically it felt like, as far as I understand, the eve of their immigration, it became understood by everyone that Dina couldn't come. Her oldest daughter couldn't come. And they either had to not go, or they had to just wait and have her come a little later. And so the decision was made that Dina would follow shortly thereafter. Her oldest daughter, pregnant, newly married, was left, and Babushka Dina never stopped looking back, waiting for her daughter to join them. They came to the United States in 1980 with nothing, with no one. I think when they came here, people worked as, maids and whatever else they could do, whatever odd jobs they could get to survive. Babushka Dina said, no, that's not going to be us. We are going to be what we were in Russia. The fact that we're brand new here, we have no one and nothing to rely on does not mean that we're not going to use everything in our power, everything in our minds, everything in our bodies to be the best that we possibly could be. So she worked and she studied. She worked and she studied, and she did everything in her ability to get her daughter to come and join us. She sent everything that she could spare to Dina. She called her all the time. She wrote to the consulate, she wrote to senators. She worked tirelessly for 8 years, non-stop, to make sure that Dina would come and join her. This magical Dina that I heard about for the 8 years that we were apart, from both my mother and from my grandmother, this magical person, but that all that mattered to them finally had joined. And Babushka Dina got to meet her two granddaughters for the first time. They were 5 and 7 years old, and all they had heard before were each other's voices. And finally, my grandmother, Babushka Dina, was complete. Her family was all together. And her efforts to be at a better place had finally become like a reality. I got to know Babushka Dina because I'm the oldest, before she was a doctor in America. So for my first few years, she and I got to spend a lot of time together just as a babushka. I didn't have the responsibility and the weight of all of her career and business. She used to put me down for naps and tell me stories about our little rabbits and our little family and everything else that the parents do. I got to sit with her as she studied all the time. She had book upon book upon book. There was no person that I know, well maybe except for Masha, that would read non-stop every single day, all the time, never ended. She studied. She never took things lightly. She never came unprepared to anything. She was always the most hardest working person in the world, the most brilliant. She would take me on the bus and drop me off at preschool as she continued to whatever program it was that she was used to study for her boards, and she passed them. She passed all of her boards and began her career here in the United States. She came here in her mid-50s, and she took her medical boards. She learned a language. She passed medical boards after practicing in Russia for decades, after not having to learn the American way of medicine, a completely different system. She's passed these boards. And she immediately began her practice. After years of difficulty in Russia, from war and starvation, from escaping and bombings, from a land of nothing, to immigration, and again, having nothing here in the US, living all together in a room, she made it. And she didn't make it alone. She pulled up every single one of us with her, as she always has done in all her life. For 20 years, she practiced medicine here in the US. Each one of my cousins and brother and I spent countless hours on the floor of her clinics, helping do filing and playing and drawing, because that's where she worked, and she was our matriarch. And we all grew under her shadow because her umbrella of warmth, her umbrella of generosity. She was the person that we went to solve our problems. She was the person that the community went to solve their problems. It's funny, even now when I put up a post about Babushka's death, all kinds of people responded saying, I knew her. People that I knew personally, I knew her, I treated with her. Her reach and her span was broad. People keep on calling and saying about how she found something that saved their life. She's responsible for a reach broader than any that I have known that affected so many people's lives. In fact, when I look today at these flowers, this beautiful turnout, this is what her office looked like every birthday and holiday. Filled with flowers, filled with candy, filled with chocolates. People loved her. She was amazing. My grandmother has, of course, the four of us cousins, Dina, Masha, David, and I, and the two daughters, Bella and Dina, and 7 great-grandchildren right now. Karina, Donovan, Evelyn, Anya and Eva, Joanna and Amelia. And I see so much of her in so many of us. From our grandkids, I see physically a lot, and we carry a lot with us. But in our personalities, from David's fearlessness to pursue more education and be the most he could possibly be, never stopping at enough. From Masha's brilliance and excellence, to Dina's tireless work efforts, never stopping to provide for her family, to my social personality and wanting to include everybody in my social circle. She gave us the best of what she was, and we carry her with us in everything we do. And I see it again in my own children. And little Evelyn's physique reminds me of my grandmother and her headstrong personality. My little Karina's studiousness and dedication to her brother and sister. And my little Donovan's creativity and mathematical aptitude. I feel like we all get it in Babushka, Dina, so we all move forward with her inside of us. Babushka had strength in the time of nothing, through war, starvation, immigration, and she had strength to persevere. And when she did persevere, she lived her life to the fullest. Even in the last years of her life, before the last years, she was pursuing ballroom dancing. She was traveling. I'm glad that we have her in our hearts and our souls. And thank you for coming today to remember her with us.